What most people missed about the trade war between America and Canada is that only one side was actually fighting. While Washington escalated, threatened, and demanded, Ottawa did something far more devastating. They went quiet, and that silence, as it turned out, was the most effective weapon in the entire conflict. I've been analyzing political strategy for decades, and I can tell you that the most dangerous mistake any leader can make is assuming that volume equals authority. When one side responds to every provocation with theatrical escalation while the other maintains disciplined restraint, the outcome isn't in doubt, it's inevitable. And what we witnessed in the trade conflict between America and Canada was perhaps the most perfect example of this dynamic I've ever seen. The public story, as most Americans understood it, was straightforward enough. Tariffs were imposed, trade tensions escalated, negotiations continued, but this narrative missed the fundamental asymmetry that determined the outcome from the very beginning. America was fighting a trade war. Canada was demonstrating why trade wars are self-defeating when one participant refuses to abandon rational calculation. Let me take you inside the actual mechanics of how this played out, because the contrast is instructive for anyone who wants to understand how institutional power really operates in moments of crisis. When the Trump administration announced sweeping tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and other strategic exports, the expectation in Washington was clear. Canada would retaliate proportionally, escalate gradually, and eventually negotiate from a position of acknowledged weakness. That expectation revealed a profound misunderstanding of both Canadian political culture and basic economic reality. Canada's response was so methodical, so deliberately understated, that American officials initially interpreted it as confusion or weakness. They were wrong on both counts. What they were witnessing was strategic discipline applied with surgical precision. Instead of matching American escalation measure for measure, Canada implemented targeted responses designed to inflict maximum political pain on specific American constituencies while avoiding the broader economic disruption that comprehensive retaliation would have caused. Instead of engaging in rhetorical combat, Canadian officials maintained professional language and procedural calm. Most importantly, instead of treating each new American provocation as a crisis requiring immediate dramatic response, they treated the entire episode as a management problem requiring steady, consistent policy application. This difference in approach wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical, and it revealed something uncomfortable about American political culture that extends far beyond trade policy. We have created a system that rewards performance over results, escalation over effectiveness, and immediate gratification over long-term strategic thinking. Canada demonstrated what the alternative looks like. The most revealing aspect of Canada's approach was how little public attention it generated. While American trade policy became a daily political drama, complete with Twitter announcements and cable news speculation, Canadian trade policy remained exactly what trade policy should be: boring, predictable, and professionally administered. That boring competence became a devastating competitive advantage. Here's why that matters for you as someone trying to understand how power actually works in the modern world. Markets don't respond to rhetoric, they respond to predictability. Investors don't reward drama, they reward consistency. Trading partners don't accommodate chaos, they root around it. When one country treats trade policy as performance art and another treats it as bureaucratic administration, capital flows toward the bureaucrats every time. You could see this dynamic playing out in real time as American businesses began quietly adjusting their supply chains to reduce exposure to policy volatility. Companies that had operated seamlessly across the border for decades suddenly found themselves planning around the possibility that rules might change overnight based on social media posts or cable news coverage. That uncertainty tax is real, and it's expensive. Meanwhile, Canadian businesses were operating in an environment where tomorrow's trade policy was likely to resemble today's trade policy, where government communication followed established channels rather than improvisational social media, and where retaliation, when it came, was proportional, targeted, and clearly communicated in advance. Which environment would you choose for long-term investment planning? But the strategic dimension extends beyond economics into something more fundamental about how democratic institutions maintain legitimacy under pressure. Canada demonstrated that strength in international relations often comes from the disciplined refusal to let external pressure dictate internal decision-making processes. When faced with escalatory rhetoric and unpredictable policy shifts, they maintained institutional procedures, constitutional norms, and professional standards. This consistency wasn't passive, it was active strategic communication. Every measured response, every procedural adherence, every refusal to escalate rhetorically sent the same message. Canadian institutions were reliable enough to absorb external shocks without fundamental alteration. American institutions, by contrast, appeared to be reorganizing themselves around the demands of daily crisis management. The human cost of this institutional difference became visible in border communities that depended on predictable cross-border commerce. When trade policy becomes erratic, business planning becomes impossible. When business planning becomes impossible, employment becomes uncertain. When employment becomes uncertain, communities suffer. The Canadians understood this relationship and structured their responses to minimize disruption to the underlying economic relationships that millions of people depend on. American policy, by contrast, seemed designed to maximize disruption as a negotiating tactic without serious consideration of how that disruption would affect the very people it claimed to protect. This is where theatrical politics becomes not just ineffective but actively harmful to the interests it purports to serve. What's especially striking about Canada's strategic restraint is how it exposed the limitations of America's traditional approach to international pressure. For decades, American foreign policy operated on the assumption that escalatory pressure would eventually force accommodation. When pressure was met, not with capitulation, but with patient counterpressure, the entire strategy collapsed into self-defeating repetition. You could watch this dynamic unfold as American trade rhetoric became increasingly detached from economic reality. When initial tariffs failed to produce desired political outcomes, the response was more tariffs. When more tariffs failed to improve the situation, the response was threats of additional tariffs. At no point did the strategy adjust to account for the possibility that the fundamental premise was flawed. Canada, meanwhile, was demonstrating something that should have been obvious but apparently wasn't to American policymakers. In economic relationships between developed democracies, sustainable outcomes require mutual consent. When one party abandons that principle, the other party doesn't automatically capitulate, it adapts. And adaptation, over time, reduces dependence on the relationship that was supposed to provide leverage. This is why the trade conflict ultimately represented an American strategic defeat, despite the perception of American economic dominance. Size and volume don't automatically translate into influence when the larger party behaves unpredictably and the smaller party maintains institutional competence. Influence requires trust, and trust requires reliability. Canada preserved both. America sacrificed both for the illusion of immediate tactical advantage. The lesson here extends far beyond trade policy into the fundamental question of how democratic societies maintain effective governance in an era of populist pressures. Canada showed that it's possible to absorb external pressure without abandoning institutional norms, to respond to provocation without escalating to dysfunction, and to defend national interests without sacrificing long-term credibility. For American observers, this should be sobering. It demonstrates that the chaos we've normalized as the price of political engagement isn't inevitable or necessary. Other democracies facing similar pressures have maintained institutional stability while achieving better practical outcomes. The difference isn't resources or geography, it's discipline. As I reflect on this episode, what strikes me most is how completely avoidable the entire confrontation was. The fundamental trade relationship between America and Canada was mutually beneficial and sustainably structured. The disruption came not from irreconcilable economic interests, but from a political approach that mistook theatrical confrontation for effective negotiation. Canada's response offers a model for how democracies can defend their interests while maintaining the institutional integrity that makes them worth defending in the first place. Sometimes the most powerful response to chaos isn't counter-chaos. It's the disciplined demonstration of what competent governance actually looks like. And that demonstration, quiet as it was, may prove to be the most consequential outcome of the entire trade conflict. not because it changed any particular policy, but because it showed that alternatives to institutional decay are still possible when societies choose discipline over drama.